Welcome to Caribbean Business Review, where insight meets impact. We bring you economic and financial updates, sharp statistical breakdowns, and data-driven insights on the forces shaping the region. Smart analysis, bold ideas, real Caribbean intelligence. This is CBI. Welcome to episode 1 of season 3 of the Caribbean Business Review. I'm Joseph Cox. Now, first of all, let me wish everyone a happy and prosperous 2026, while I thank you for your continued support across all our social media channels and MKR Radio. This week, our special guest is Mr. Leo Preville, former Director, Single Market CARICOM, former Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Trade, and now Senior Opposition Politician in St. Lucia, where we will be discussing navigating the future of the citizenship by investment and the attendant implications of potentially scrapping them. And in today's CBR briefing, we examine Caribbean business strategy in a post-Trump policy space, focusing on how shifting U.S. policies are reshaping the strategic environment for the region in 2026 and beyond. But before we begin today's briefing, there are two issues that we are obliged to bring to your attention. One, the introduction of U.S. visa bonds ranging from $5,000 to $15,000 effective January 21 for nationals of Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica marks a clear escalation in the use of mobility as a policy lever. Framed around U.S. disquiet with citizenship by investment programs, these measures restrict access by raising the financial threshold for travel rather than imposing outright bans. More concerning is that this stance is no longer isolated, with the European Union signaling a similarly hardened approach within the Schengen area. As the Premier of Nevis, Mark Brantley, has warned, this moment signals the end of the CBI as a standalone development pillar, forcing small states to pivot towards deeper economic diversification, domestic and diaspora investment, and productive capital formation to sustain long-term resilience. The second issue is the U.S. withdrawal from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change on January 7th. Now, this is not symbolic. It represents a structural shift in global climate advocacy. When the world's largest historical emitter exits, negotiating gravity weakens, compliance norms erode, and multilateral processes lose credibility. Climate finance is directly affected, with reduced contributions to key funds, less concessional support for adaptation and loss and damage, and slower mobilization of blended finance. Now, while the Paris Agreement remains legally intact, targets become aspirational and enforcement relies largely on peer pressure. For CARICOM states, this means less predictable climate finance, greater reliance on MDBs, and Europe, a stronger security framing for resilience, and increased pressure to monetize adaptation through insurance and parametric tools. Now, with that clarity in hand, let's turn to the stories we are now working on this hour for the Market Watch and Global Pulse segments. Coming up in the Market Watch, Jamaica's airport traffic recovering slowly. U.S. visa bonds tighten travel for Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica, and Bahamas' fiscal deficit narrows sharply. Then in the Global Pulse, U.S. trade deficit hits post-crisis low, Eurozone inflation hits ECB target, and Trump moves to control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely. All that and more this hour on Market Watch and Global Pulse. Coming up next is a CBR briefing. This is your CBR briefing. I'm Joseph Cox. Now, a defining metric of human behavior is that we are all a collective of our choices, not our intentions, not our rhetoric, not even our aspirations. History is written by decisions taken under pressure, by what societies tolerate, reward, and repeat. That framing matters because one of the most consequential strategic questions facing Caribbean businesses today is not simply who occupies the White House, but whether the United States is entering a durable policy regime or merely passing through a time-limited political episode. If this is only Trump policy, Caribbean firms can plan around a temporary disturbance. If it, however, reflects a deeper realignment in U.S. political incentives, then the region must prepare for structural uncertainty with implications for trade, finance, mobility, and investment confidence. This distinction matters because the Caribbean is not marginally exposed to the United States. Roughly 70% of stayover tourism arrivals, a significant share of remittances, and the backbone of correspondent banking and payment flows are tied directly or indirectly to U.S. policy signals. Also, for many Caribbean economies, the U.S. is the dominant source of external demand. That's not background risk, that's balance sheet risk. So the first strategic question is unavoidable. What happens when the Trump presidency is over? Presidencies end, but policy incentives do not disappear automatically. If voters and donors continue to reward hardline trade, tight borders, and security first diplomacy, then future leaders, regardless of personality, inherit a political market that punishes moderation. For the Caribbean, that uncertainty transmits quickly through tourism demand, trade and shipping costs, financial compliance, and diaspora mobility. So the real strategic choice becomes this. Do we treat U.S. policy as cyclical risk or structural risk? Now, would a post-Trump Republican administration change course? Here the logic is uncomfortable. Political parties reorganized around dominant leaders tend to produce successors who compete by imitation, not repudiation. That suggests a post-Trump Republican administration could look more orderly, but not necessarily more accommodating. In other words, Trumpism with better staffing. For Caribbean businesses, that implies not waiting it out, but institutionalizing resilience. Diversified markets, diversified payment rails, diversified logistics, and tighter country risk intelligence. Now, what if the Democrats prevail? Even if Democrats win future elections, there's little basis to assume a full policy reset. If trade as security and border as politics have become durable voter priorities, then even a Democratic administration may govern inside narrower lanes than many expect. At best, the region may see a muted recalibration, softer language, selective reversals, but many hardened positions remaining intact. Now, which brings us to the most important point. Caribbean agency matters. The question is not only what Washington chooses, but whether Caribbean governments and firms choose to keep outsourcing strategic certainty to one market. If policy volatility is now a feature of the global system, then the Caribbean's advantage is not a prediction, it's preparedness. 3 strategic moves follow. 1. Scenario plan, U.S. exposure. 2. Reduce single market dependence. And 3. Treat policy as a business input, not background noise. So the defining question is no longer whether the Trump era ends, it will. The real question is whether Caribbean business strategy is built for a world where policy continuity is no longer guaranteed by elections. Because the greatest risk to the region is not a Republican administration or a Democratic one, but planning as if either automatically delivers stability. And history is unforgiving to those who mistake hope for strategy. Now that's your CBR briefing. This is your market brief. In the Cayman Islands, stamp duty revenues are projected to exceed $100 million in 2026, following a hike to 10% of property transactions above $2 million. Cayman stayover arrivals rose 7.5% year-on-year in November, while Barbados hotels report 90 to 100% occupancy. In contrast, Jamaica's Sangster's airport traffic fell 44% year-on-year in December, despite $331 million in post-storm tourism earnings. Remittances to Jamaica softened in October, but year-to-date inflows remain positive. External linkages are tightening. U.S. Visa bonds of up to $15,000 for Antigua and Dominica risk dampening short-stay travel and diaspora flows, while Belize restored U.S. postal shipments under a new duty-paid system. Bermuda now ranks as the world's most expensive destination for mobile data, underscoring structural cost issues in small telecoms markets. On the macro front, the Bahamas cut its early year fiscal deficit by 32%, even as public debt rose to $13.5 billion US. Trinidad and Tobago's energy output rebounded 10.4%. Finally, global reinsurance rates fell 12% at January renewals, easing insurance costs. Now that's your market brief on Caribbean Business Review. For more, look for us on YouTube and Spotify.
In a world of constant change, insight is your greatest asset. At Joseph Cox and Associates, we empower innovation across the Caribbean. Whatever your challenge, we can help. We're proudly customer-centric, offering bespoke solutions tailored to every partner. From innovation and digital transformation to leadership and policy, our services are designed to deliver lasting impact. We partner with leaders across sectors, from finance and government to energy, tech, and infrastructure, helping them navigate complexity with confidence. Our work is grounded in collaboration. We connect regional leaders through powerful networks, driving change through joint research. Discover more at josephcox.org. Joseph Cox and Associates. Insight, experience, impact.
Ahead on Caribbean Business Review, our conversation with Leo Preville, former director, Single Market, CARICOM, OECS advocate, and St. Lucian politician, where we discuss the future of citizenship by investment programs.
The fact that this is going to be removed, inevitably that's where the direction seems to point, it means we should now be preparing ourselves, preparing contingency arrangements for the absence of those resources.
Welcome back to Caribbean Business Review. I'm Joseph Cox, and now we're going to our strategy deep dive. And today our special guest is Leo Preville. You have been the former director of the Single Market at CARICOM. You are a senior member of the opposition in St. Lucia, which makes you a politician.
Yes.
You have been a former permanent secretary in the matters
the government
of
of
trade.
St. Lucia.
Right, in St. Lucia. So, in other words, you are truly what they would consider to be a veteran in this process.
Yes, Joe, thank you. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, my friend. No, you know, one of the things that strikes me with what's going on around us, right through this region, is, you know, this old saying, may you live in interesting times. I don't know that we can get any more interesting. Because right now, from where your vantage point, Titus, in St. Lucia, I mean, you have to look around you at your neighboring countries, etc. And what are we seeing? We're seeing a lot of pressure being brought to bear in terms of the Citizenship by Investment program, where United States they have claimed that because of that, they have suspended certain privileges to Antigua and Barbuda and St. Lucia. Frankly speaking, everybody knows that the CBI, the Citizenship by Investment program, is a fiscal smoothing mechanism and a revenue generator for other countries within the Eastern Caribbean, including St. Lucia. Now, United States is putting pressure. The European Union is also putting pressure. This is not a negotiated position anymore. They're basically saying you must discontinue these programs. From your vantage point, what is the future of this thing? From where you sit, Titus, can, for example, a St. Lucia, or in fact, any of the OECS really discontinue use of the CBI revenues? Let me put it that way.
Thank you, Joe, again. And we're in 2026 January, and what a way to start the year. We, like you said, we would have noticed towards December of last year, the United States taking a fairly rigorous position on Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica. with respect to their citizenship by investment programs, essentially restricting Dominicans' access to the United States. And access here mean by the issuance of visas to get permission to enter the United States, because all of us, those countries in the Caribbean, we still need visa access into the United States, Dominica and Antigua being no exception. And just to say, I know my name says Leo Preville, and you keep saying Titus, so I am Leo Titus Preville. So that there's consistency in who you're referring to. Yes, Joe, the citizenship by investment program, and when we think about it, these programs, when a country decides to go the route of, in a sense, trading its citizenship for income, this really is really speaking to the heart of your identity. And when you will trade your identity for income, it must take a lot from you as a country to reach a position where you believe that this is an option to be considered for development. So these programs inherently would require, or the proceeds of these programs would inherently be channeled to areas that are of great importance, or should be channeled to areas of great importance. These are not run-of-the-mill type revenue-generating measures that we are accustomed to in the old governance systems. And therefore, if these programs are going to be suspended for any reason, it would have an impact on the areas that these programs would most likely be impacting because of their nature. And these would be your CAPEX programs in the main, your CAPEX programs, which would tend to focus on areas that would lead to transformation of your economy. It would probably, these monies would generally go to areas that would impact your infrastructure, your port infrastructure, your road infrastructure, your healthcare. Not in terms of recurring costs, but in terms of expanding your access to your health systems. And of course, importantly, your education systems, because that's where the human capital would be formed to drive economies. So what we're seeing actually is these programs, and you've mentioned the US and we've mentioned the EU also, these programs that are coming under increased scrutiny will have an impact on the capital expenditure transformation elements of the member states in the OECS. In the main, the 5 practicing member states with CBI programs, it would have an impact on them. Let us be clear. We've seen that since the commencement of these programs, the estimate puts it at just about over 100,000 such passports. And the CBI really is about the citizenship by investment via the granting of passports to persons who may not be necessarily nationals of any one of the 5 member states. When we speak of 5 member states, just to give people listening and viewing an opportunity to know who we refer to, or the member states we refer to. We talk about Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Lucia. These are the 5 member states in the OECS and in the wider CARICOM that practice citizenship by investment. So this would put an immediate impact. We, at one stage, the EU in particular, its posture was one that focused more on ensuring that there was proper due diligence and compliance with respect to the regulatory procedures to ensure that only desirables, so to speak, were the ones being issued with passports from those countries mentioned. But over time, we've seen a shift and a hardening of the position of the EU Commission, and now in effect saying that notwithstanding the steps, the regulatory strengthening steps that are expected, these would only be a transitionary type arrangement for the CBI program. And that
Meaning
in
shut
effect,
it down.
once you have such a program, your citizens would not be liable for granting visa-free access into the Schengen area in the EU. And what would that mean for the people of the region, for instance? Visa-free access into the Schengen area makes it much easier to move into Europe. In the case of St. Lucia, which is next door to Martinique, 10 minutes by flying, an hour and a half on a boat. We have very, very deep and long-standing relations with Martinique, and a number of us go there for emergency medical care. We have families there, and the fact that you don't need a visa to get to Martinique for a 3-month period changes the dynamic, changes the mobility and the ease of access for services. And if now we go back to the period of a visa, it would have implications for our people directly, separate and apart from the government and the people suffering from the revenue that would have been lost.
Fallout, right.
From this
but
program.
then Titus, but let me ask you this, because this is not something that is possible or otherwise. This is very real. Because if the stance that the United States has taken and now the European Union, it is very clear that this is imminent, right? You have to treat with this. Now, the practical reality of it is, what do you do? How do you cope? Because yes, on the one hand, you have the inconvenience of not being able to access even nearby islands. But from the other standpoint, you're talking about a severe fiscal fallout. And if we are to be guided further by what just recently happened with Antigua and Dominica, whereby now their citizens are being told that for applicants for visa entry, for B1, B2, visitor visa entry into the United States, they have to post a bond of up to $15,000. So in other words, the entire mechanism is being tightened to the point where you have no choice but to respond accordingly.
Well, Joe, I think we need to do what we've always done. The Citizenship by Investment program, in the case of St. Lucia, I think started somewhere just after 2015, 2016, thereabout. In other words, long before those programs were in place, our countries existed. And we developed. In fact, if you ask me, the major development that took place for these countries didn't take place with the support or assistance of the CBI programs. They took place outside of that framework. So we need, and that's why I said that this CBI program should never have been treated as part of your normal sources of revenue. It should always have been seen as some extra dividend. And therefore, you should always have been prepared not to factor that into your normal processes.
All right.
The fact that this is going to be removed, and inevitably that's where the direction seems to point, it means we should now be preparing ourselves, preparing contingency arrangements for the absence of those resources. And the fact that the EU in particular is taking the posture of technically gradually withdrawing access, it signals to, I think, the members, the states with CBI programs, that we should use that period to restructure your fiscal policy, re-examine the possible sources of income, and focus on matters that we know we should really be focusing on, which is, in my view, deepening our regional integration, strengthening our regional integration, making it easier to do business in the region, and doing the things that we know that we have a little more control over, and subject more to our own actions and so forth. So I think
all right,
this is where it's pointing us
hear
to.
you. No, man, I hear you on that. But then you now have what I call a stacked crisis, because on the back of that, you also now have they call it the ouster of Maduro in Venezuela. And that now would suggest functionally and practically the complete end of the Petrocaribe program. Now, most of the countries in that region also have liabilities, outstanding liabilities under the program. Now, what is likely to happen is that you're likely to, the repayments will no longer be concessional. Do not be surprised if you get some IMF-style conditionalities to drive the process, etc., etc. So what I'm looking at is, call it a stacked fiscal crisis. Now, how do you cope with something like that when it's coming? I mean, this is completely outside of your control. There's nothing you can do about that. But how do you cope in the short and medium term with something like that quickly?
I think we need to. It's like you're getting squeezed from both ends of a stick.
That is precisely the point.
Your sources of capital is being removed, or resources for capital expansion is being removed, and where you could have had concessional access to certain energy costs, energy and other support, this is being taken away. It would require for strong fiscal discipline, Joe. It would require us to be at this point to be perhaps recalculating our revenue expansion program, our cost expansion programs. In other words, the programs that we would have undertaken that would have had significant recurrent cost implications as countries, we need to spend significant time reviewing this right now, because this will have implications and for our budgets, our balance of payments, and number of issues. So in an environment like this, as small states, in CARICOM, in the short term and in the medium term, I see us as turning to each other quickly, deeply, and looking at how we can collectively face those challenges by doing what the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas ambassador called for. They call for us to look at functional cooperation at a deeper, much deeper level. They call for us to look at significantly investing in each other's member states and boosting production and boosting efficiency of production for exports to those countries that we have already negotiated bilateral arrangements with through our economic partnership agreement in the case of the EU. And of course, with the UK. And in the case of the US, given the posture we have there now, whatever we can do, we may have to do, because we are facing a 10% tariff as we speak across the board. But it gives us the opportunity now to look at Canada in a new way, if you ask me, because we were supposed to have concluded a new CARICOM Canada agreement, trade agreement, or economic development package. That fell through. We may now want to take a closer look at this. I think right now the issue for me as a St. Lucian, a politician practicing, emerging politician in St. Lucia, is to say that our people need to look towards each other in the region as a collective more now than ever. And using that now, how do we leverage the more critical mass we will have in the areas we have already identified, in the industrial policy of CARICOM, in the agricultural policy of CARICOM, in those critical areas? How do we leverage that? And it will force us to look at the significant issue of further integrating our economies from both the access to capital side with our regional stock exchange and so forth, and our currency situation.
But Titus, no, I'm hearing you on this, and it sounds nice. It really does, and I can't fault you on that. But here comes some practical considerations now. I mean, from where I sit, CARICOM is now absolutely fragmented. One of the strengths of CARICOM over the years is in terms of its functional cooperation. Underpinning a lot of that was the Caribbean was always deemed to be a zone of peace. Trinidad has basically put an end to that entire notion, and there is no replacement concept for that, or dictum, or edict, or anything according to that. So now we end up with a situation whereby pretty much, Trinidad is going its own way. Some members of the OECS, they are caught in a bind and they have to negotiate their way out of certain challenges, etc., etc. That's one level. The second level is that just looking at some natural synergies. Jamaica, for example, their strength is not so much in CARICOM. It's more what we loosely call the Northern Caribbean Alliance, which we like the Bahamas, Dam Rep, Cuba, etc. Belize is a bridge state. Belize's thing is always towards Central America rather than CARICOM. Yes, they do business with CARICOM, don't get me wrong, but they're more a bridge state. The OECS is the OECS. Barbados is more aligned to the OECS principles, and there's a natural synergy there. Guyana and Suriname are looking to Brazil and South America. So in other words, when you speak to this deeper integration process within CARICOM, is that a realistic should I say goal to have in this dynamic, or should we look at more practical considerations?
Well, I see what you've described it, Joe, almost as separate blocks or separate economic windows for member states to consider, for countries to consider, sorry, not just member states, for countries to consider in the current situation. That might appear attractive, and that might be something that member states or countries may wish to take a closer look at. But my humble opinion, there is nothing that says you do not do this while not continuing to focus on strengthening your regional arrangements. Because what we are seeing happening is that a number of those things, when we think we have something that we could bank on, they might fall apart at the time you wish them not to fall apart for reasons that are out of your control. I would think it would make a lot of sense not closing the door on or using the opportunities that present themselves. Yeah, Belize has a natural bridge to Latin America and to Central America.
Right.
No, I would encourage Belize, and you would encourage Belize to strengthen that. But we should simultaneously look at how we work more closely with Belize in strengthening our own arrangements. In other words, I don't see them as either or. I see them as options we need to work and examine simultaneously while strengthening our regional arrangements. Because when all else will fail, this is really what we will have that will keep us going. And I think COVID taught us that. In the face of COVID, what was left for us to turn to coordinate ourselves when the world was turning inward? And if you think about it, Joe, in the post-COVID period, many states have not gone back from the inward-looking position. I think you've seen a move towards more nationalism as opposed to multilateralism, or even plurilateral arrangements.
Right.
So we have, as we speak, an arrangement already that is more than 50 years. I think we need to relook it. I think we need to make it fit for purpose now. I think we need to give it more flexibility in how it works. But it is something we have, and we have more control over. I tend to see the situation with Trinidad in the particular circumstances here in the environment we are in is not necessarily inconsistent with CARICOM. I say so because when you look at the revised treaty, it speaks to coordination of foreign policy arrangements. And it's very important that, we remember we are not a political union. We are an economic union. And therefore, what we've been seeking to deepen is our economic integration. Now, the situation facing Trinidad, if you ask me, is a foreign policy matter. Now, to the extent we can coordinate, it does not mean harmonize. We coordinate as much as you can. But I see in the case of Trinidad and Tobago that the geography that they are physically in a situation that is different to Jamaica. And therefore, their approach to the problem will have to be, I suspect, a little different.
No, I'm not.
That's how I look at the matter.
I'm not disagreeing with you on that, but the point is simply this, that, and I'll go back to the fundamental principle of the zone of peace, because by completely eschewing that principle, what has happened now is that the region, you see, you have to understand something. Well, but what is the real scenario on the ground? You have United States using their military might to blow up what they call drug ships or drug boats, etc., etc. That has a chilling effect for your fisheries. It also has a chilling effect for your yachting sectors, which are big things around down the eastern part of the Caribbean. No question about that. So that's one. Two, there is something now that has come out that has been put out known as a notice to airmen, NOTAM, right? Now that came out on the 4th of January. And that speaks to that operators within the PRCO flight information region, that operators are advised, and I'm reading it, they are advised to exercise caution when operating in the PRCO flight information region west of 57 degrees west at all altitudes. Due to military activity, threats could pose a potential risk to aircraft at all altitudes, including during overflight, the arrival and departure phases of flight. Now, Titus, let's be very clear. Right across the region, you're looking at tourism ranging, dependent on the country, you're looking at anywhere between 15 to 88% of GDP. That's how significant tourism is. I was reading earlier where in Canada, based on what has happened now, a lot of the tourists there, a lot of the potential visitors are canceling their trips. Because, for example, those looking to the ABC Islands, which are a couple nautical miles from Venezuela, they just say, no, they're canceling that. The reality that I'm bringing to the table is that I wish the Trinidad position was that, well, we are just defending our national interests and that's where it is. The PRCO flight information region covers everything straight from Antigua right down to pretty much, I'm not sure if it goes down as far as Guyana, but close enough to Guyana. But it also goes out towards the mid-Atlantic. So in other words, it's a large area that affects a number of countries. It creates a challenge in terms of the tourism flows, etc. So, I mean, I hear you, but I'm not sure that I wish I could agree to say, well, that's really just their sovereign right, which it is. But the impacts, well.
Yeah, but Joe, I think you're actually making the case for us to strengthen our foreign policy coordination even more. You're absolutely right. Given this the space that is covered by the arrangements for flight control information and coming out of Trinidad, it directly impacts our economies in the Eastern Caribbean and the Caribbean on the whole. Now, how do you respond to this? This is not a matter that was instigated by Jamaica or Trinidad. or any Eastern Caribbean country or Caribbean country. It is a matter that came about from an external superpower. Now, how do you approach this superpower? Do you go at it as one member state per member state, or you go and sit and do the best you can as a collective? It's only as a collective, a group of countries, that we would stand a chance of our collective situation being given the attention it should. Because this really, Joe, is a major disruption to an entire region's set of people's lives.
Of course it is, but the issue is simply is how can you go as a collective when one of your larger members, relatively speaking, is basically distancing themselves from the position that we have held as a collective over many decades? How do you treat with that? Because remember, yes, you're right. But CARICOM's strength has always been in the functional cooperation. Yes, it's a matter of cooperation. It's not, you can't dictate to a country. But I mean, when you have dissonance on something as significant as this, then I'm not sure how much latitude you really have and power you really retain for negotiations.
There is, and I see that is the only way forward. You see, because while we have, and I say I have to treat the situation from Trinidad from a foreign policy perspective. I understand that. Perhaps maybe the way the extent of the responses could have been looked at in a different way, but essentially, if this region, if CARICOM, this region here, the member states of CARICOM were to sustain economic decline of any significant measure as a result of what is happening, it's going to affect Trinidad and Tobago. The truth of the matter, and this is the economic reality, that the region is the biggest trading partner. When you remove oil and gas from Trinidad and Tobago, the region is the biggest trading partner for Trinidad and Tobago. So the region needs to be successful for Trinidad and Tobago to be successful. So it is not a matter of going it alone. The way forward must be going at it together. You might be at a different pace, but we have to go at it as together as we can. This is the reality we have before us now.
No, I hear you on that, I hear you on that. But then you see, when we come down to the real rub of it, and we start to look at how do we go forward with this? So I have to ask you, we're now just in January 2026, but what is your outlook for this year? Because with what has been happening with Venezuela, there are all sorts of military interventions being threatened globally, right? And in that sort of dynamic, our trade flows will get disrupted. Costs will go up because one of the reasons I raised the issue about the note to airmen, the so-called NOTAM, is that once you start to have that uncertainty, you will have people eventually starting to reroute flights. So you have things start to cost a little bit more. You have less frequencies in certain areas, dependent on how this matter escalates. But this is not something that we are still a very open economies, really import dependent, no matter what we want to say. Mm-hmm. Also, the bulk of our revenues come from tourism flows. So I don't know. When I look on this picture, I'm saying, so how do we go forward? What is it you think we should do as a region? What is it that, for example, St. Lucia should do from your vantage point?
The notion of an economic outlook for 2026. I don't think anyone who's smart enough will ever want to hazard a guess, because the variables out there are just so much in flux. So, and I mean, the points you've raised in terms of the implication for trade in terms of both costs and even the logistics costs. And if you have any further disruptions in shipping in terms of availability of shipping, then you obviously would have, as we saw during COVID, an escalation in the cost of shipping. So, and that has direct implications for cost of living, which is already an issue coming out of COVID. And many of us seem to sometimes put it under the carpet. The COVID effects are still present.
Absolutely.
So Joe, in terms of what do we do going forward for 2026, a lot of it depends, my friend, on what happens with our big brother and the extent, the duration, what is done in the region with Venezuela. A lot of it depends. If we have a quick settlement of the issues there, that would lessen the tension, because we need to bring down the tension. We need to bring more certainty. We need to get this place remaining a zone of peace. That is the factor that is out of our control. It is out of our control. The situation impacts every aspect of our economy, from the most critical being tourism to our actual livelihood based on trade. And that has revenue implications. A lot of our revenue from trade, for government, comes from trade at the border through the application of our collection of revenue for the tariffs. So a government of St. Lucia today, in my view, should be taking a very close look at all of those variables and should be looking at its budget posture. Because budget, for instance, would be the new budget cycle commences, as in Jamaica's case, I believe, in April of the year. Our end of fiscal year is March 31. Yes.
Yeah, sure.
So I would expect a fairly conservative type of approach to spending and in the next year. Now, this would obviously have implications for growth. It would have implications for unemployment. So the outlook, as I see 2026 evolving, does not look very encouraging. But it would be a bad thing to speculate, because anything we say here would be speculation. But one thing is certain, Joe. It depends, a lot of what will happen in 26 depends on how soon, how quickly, how not efficiently, how decisive we see an end to the situation between the United States and Venezuela in the region.
All right.
I think
Fair
that
enough.
is one of our greatest challenges.
Yeah, man. Okay, fair enough. And that's where we have to leave it here for today. As Leo Titus Preville, see, I'll give you a full name now. Leo Titus Preville, who is a senior member of the opposition party in St. Lucia, former director of Single Market at CARICOM, former permanent secretary for trade in St. Lucia, a veteran in these matters of diplomacy and economics. So thank you so much, Titus, for your interventions. I hope we'll be able to continue this conversation from time to time.
Thank you very much, Joe, and I look forward to participating whenever the occasion arises. Thank you.
Thanks much. Good.
In a world of constant change, insight is your greatest asset. At Joseph Cox and Associates, we empower innovation across the Caribbean. Whatever your challenge, we can help. We're proudly customer-centric, offering bespoke solutions tailored to every partner. From innovation and digital transformation to leadership and policy, our services are designed to deliver lasting impact. We partner with leaders across sectors, from finance and government to energy, tech, and infrastructure, helping them navigate complexity with confidence. Our work is grounded in collaboration. We connect regional leaders through powerful networks, driving change through joint research. Discover more at josephcox.org. Joseph Cox and Associates. Insight, experience, impact.
Welcome to Market Watch. I'm Joseph Cox. Tourism momentum across the region remains mixed but generally positive. In the Cayman Islands, stay-over arrivals rose 7.5% in November, supported by expanded U.S. and Canadian airlift. Barbados is seeing an exceptionally strong winter start, with several hotels already at 90 to 100% occupancies. Stay-overs are up 5.4% and RevPAR has climbed over 15%. By contrast, Jamaica's air traffic recovery remains uneven. Sanksa's International Airport processed 44% fewer passengers year-on-year in December following Hurricane Melissa, although early winter arrivals and tourism earnings of $331 million US since the storm point to gradual recovery. Turning to fiscal and financial conditions, Bahamas posted a 32% reduction in its fiscal deficit in the first 2 months of fiscal 25-26, driven by higher VAT compliance and lower spending. However, public debt still climbed to $13.6 billion. However, the banking sector credit quality improved, with non-performing loans falling to 5% and household arrears declining year-on-year. In Trinidad, energy output rebounded 10.4%, supported by new gas production, but non-energy sectors softened. Inflation stayed subdued at 0.5%, while slower credit growth prompted the central bank to hold rates at 3.5%. Region-wide risks are also evolving. The U.S. Department of State will impose a $5,000 to $15,000 visa ban on travelers from Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica, raising concerns over mobility, tourism demand, and diaspora ties. Meanwhile, Turks and Caicos Islands faces long-term pension sustainability challenges, with its national insurance fund projected to be depleted by 2066 without reform. Globally, reinsurance markets are easing. According to Aon and Guy Carpenter, catastrophe reinsurance rates fell 12% on average at January renewals, offering some relief to Caribbean insurers ahead of the next hurricane season. Now, before we wrap, here's a quick look at regional currencies and market performance. CARICOM exchange rates remain broadly stable, with the Bahamas, Barbados, and Belize maintaining their long-standing pegs, while Jamaica trades at 158.63 to the US dollar, Trinidad at 6.80, Suriname at 38.47, and Ghana at 2.18. Haiti's gourd traded at 131.49. In the equity markets, sentiment was broadly positive. The JSE index rose 0.41% to 328,034 points. The TTSC gained 0.6%, and the Bahamas' BISX closed 0.63% higher, while Barbados and Bermuda finished flat, and the Caribbean Exchange Index increased by 0.47%. Top gainers included West Indies Petroleum up 16.6% rather, and Mayberry Group up 10.6%. Biggest declines came from Mayberry Jamaica Equities and Sagicor Real Estate, down 17.6% and 7.6% respectively. Now that's it for your Market Watch. I'm Joseph Cox. Global Pulse is up next. This is CBR. This is Global Pulse. I'm Joseph Cox. We begin in the UK, where consumer credit accelerated sharply in November. Households borrowed £2.1 billion, up from £1.7 billion in October, with credit card borrowing alone at £1 billion. Annual card growth jumped to 12.1%, the fastest pace since early 2024. Yet retail sales volumes fell 0.1%, mortgage approvals slipped to 64,500, and households boosted bank deposits by £8.1 billion. In the United States, private sector hiring added just 41,000 jobs in December, undershooting expectations, while mortgage demand fell 9.7% despite 30-year rates easing to 6.25%. Purchase applications declined 6%, and average loan sizes dropped to a one-year low. U.S. policy moves are also reshaping energy markets. Washington plans to control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely, marketing an initial 30 to 50 million barrels. The announcement is already redirecting flows with Chinese refiners pivoting towards discounted Russian and Iranian crude, limiting price upside. In Europe, euro area inflation hit the ECB's 2% target in December, with core inflation at 2.3%. Market price only a 20% chance of a rate cut by September, as wage growth remains elevated at 4% and geopolitical risk persists. The OECD has revised this global tax deal, exempting U.S. multinationals from the 15% minimum tax, weakening efforts to curb profit shifting and raising renewed concerns for low-tax jurisdictions. On growth, the UN forecasts global expansion slowing to 2.7% in 2026 as weak investment, high debt, and climate shocks offset easing inflation. Asia remains a focal point. China's Shanghai unveiled a $10 billion technology push, while Kazakhstan is training 1 million citizens in AI by 2030, with IT exports already at $1 billion. Meanwhile, Japan is set to fall behind India as the world's fifth largest economy in 2026, reflecting yen weakness and structural constraints. Finally, in emerging markets, Brazil posted record exports of $348.7 billion, driven by China, though its trade surplus narrowed. India, by contrast, is projected to grow 7.4%. Now, turning quickly to our global commodity and stock markets, oil prices moved higher, with West Texas Intermediate up 2.35% to $59.12 and Brent rising 1.66% to $63.02. Reflecting short-term supply positioning and geopolitical risk. The OPEC basket edged up to 58.76, while natural gas fell sharply down 7% to $3.17, highlighting continued volatility in gas markets. Equity markets were broadly positive. In the U.S., the Dow gained 0.48%, the S&P 500 rose 0.65%, and the Nasdaq advanced 0.81%. Europe followed suit, with the FTSE up 0.8%, DAX up 0.53%, and CAC 40 outperforming at 1.44%. In Asia, Japan's Nikkei surged 1.66%, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng posted modest gains. Now that's it for Global Pulse. I'm Joseph Cox. This is CBR. Well, that's a wrap on episode 1 of season 3 of the Caribbean Business Review. Now, thank you so much to our loyal audience across MKR Radio and all digital platforms for your continued support. As always, we live by our mantra that knowledge is strength, but information is power. Our special thanks to Leo Preville, former Director Single Market at CARICOM and a seasoned solution technocrat and political figure who guided us through the critical issue of CBI at the Crossroads, geopolitics, revenue risk, and the future of Caribbean economic strategy. The strategic takeaways from this discussion are: 1. CBI is a regional vulnerability, not a national fix. While it remains important, rising U.S. and EU scrutiny has made CBI unreliable as a core development pillar, exposing Caribbean states to external policy shocks. 2. Geopolitics now constrains Caribbean economic choices. Post-COVID disruptions and tightening global controls have narrowed the region's strategic space, with foreign policy decisions carrying region-wide consequences. And 3, regional coordination is now a strategic necessity. Fragmented national responses increase vulnerability. Coordinated regional diplomacy is essential to manage shared risk and navigate an uncertain 2026. Now, we also wish to acknowledge with sincere appreciation the overwhelmingly positive feedback we have received on our CBR intelligence notes. Our latest note, Repriced Energy Security and Fiscal Risk in the Caribbean, is now live. You can listen to this broadcast at your convenience on Spotify. The latest edition of the Caribbean Financial Dispatch is also live on LinkedIn, WhatsApp status, and via the link in our YouTube comments. To subscribe, email us at CaribbeanBusinessReview@gmail.com. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and follow the Caribbean Business Review on TikTok, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn. Until next week, same time, same place, I'm Joseph Cox, and this has been CBR.